In recent weeks, there's been a lot of talk about a potential conscription in this country. Excuse me, I'm just moving my keyboard. Um, and this is something that's kind of been circulating for a while. There's numerous sources on this, so I'm just going to use this one for the sake of convenience. It's from the 25th of January, so it's over a week old now, but from the BBC, UK Citizen Army preparing the pre-war generation for conflict. Now, before I get into this, I'll read out the article. It's by Jonathan Beale, the defence correspondent for the BBC. Before I get into this, just to put my cards on the table, I've very mixed feelings about it, and I'll explain that afterwards. But this is a controversial issue, and so I think it's worth talking about a bit. And of course, I invite subscribers to share their thoughts below. So here's the piece. It's bear with me. I think it's important to read out the context. Talk of wider war in Europe and the potential need for mass mobilisation or a citizen army may sound alarming, but the head of the British Army, uh, General Sir Patrick Sanders, is not alone in issuing a national call to prepare for a major conflict on European soil. Last week, another senior NATO military chief said countries needed to be on alert and expect the unexpected. Admiral Rob Bauer, who heads the alliance's military committee, said the public needed to change their mindset for an era when anything can happen at any time. So that sort of rings like the late 1930s or early 1910s. The UK's Defence Secretary has also warned that we need to be prepared for war. In his first major speech on defence, Grant Shapps said the country was moving from a post-war to a pre-war world. He highlighted numerous threats, but there is one common thread amid all these warnings: Russia. Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius recently told a German newspaper, "We have to take into account that Vladimir Putin might even attack a NATO country one day." While he said that such an attack is unlikely now, our experts expect a period of 5 to 8 years in which this could be possible. And I think that's even quite conservative when you consider where the Baltic states are. That's just my own opinion. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has focused the West's military minds. As General Sir Patrick Sanders stated several times in his speech on Wednesday, Ukraine really matters. Russia's ambitions, he said, were not just about seizing territory, but about defeating our system and way of life politically, psychologically, and symbolically. There is a sense in the upper echelons of the British military that many politicians and most of the public have not grasped the threat they see. It is the duty of the military to analyse that threat, and they still might be proved wrong, but European nations close to the Russian borders appear to be taken more seriously. General Sanders specifically mentioned Sweden. Earlier this month, its civil defence minister told a defence conference it could be war in Sweden. Carl Oskar Bolin said asked the public, "Have you considered whether you have time to join a voluntary defence organisation? If not, get moving." His remarks are backed up by the country's top military commander, who said Sweden should prepare itself mentally. Bear in mind, Sweden hasn't formally joined NATO yet, although it's on the cusp of doing so. Some in the country criticised the remarks as alarmist, but others have responded by prepping for war, stocking food and fuel. I mean, this is quite serious. A number of European countries also rehearse for civil emergencies with exercises that involve ordinary citizens as well as the military. It's often called total defence. A number of northern European countries, including Sweden, have already a form of conscription for their armed forces. Conscription requires young men and women to serve for a limited time in uniform. It means that some of the population will have had some military training and can be assigned to reserve units should war break out. In Sweden and Norway, conscription is partial. Not everyone gets drafted, but it boosts the strength of the professional armed forces, which is often relatively small. Finland, NATO's newest member and a country which has an 800-mile border with Russia, has wider conscription. Around 80% of the male population complete some form of military service. Refusal can mean a jail sentence, although there is the option of civilian service out of uniform too. I guess that's to factor in conscientious objectors. The overall effect means Finland can muster one of Europe's largest armies. The size of its active armed forces is only 19,000 personnel, but can call in another 238,000 reserves. And my understanding is Finland has very modern equipment. It's unlike 100 years ago when it was quite a poor state. It's modern, it's wealthy, and it also has experience with Russia, the very costly Winter War in 39-40 with the Soviet Union. Is UK conscription for a citizen army a realistic plan? In the UK, national service, the country's old name for conscription, ended in 1960. There are no plans to bring it back. General Sanders was not calling for conscription in his speech. That's very important. He is a strong believer in a professional army made up of volunteers, but he was making the point that if war broke out, troop numbers would be too small. Cuts have already seen the size of the British Army fall from more than 100,000 in 2010 to around 73,000 now, and I read somewhere that is actually the lowest level we've had since the Napoleonic Wars. 73,000. That's a pretty small army for a country of 68 million people. General Sanders said that within the next 3 years the British Army needed to be 120,000 strong with the addition of reserves, but he said even that is not enough, so the army should be designed to expand rapidly and enable the first echelon resource, the second echelon, and train up and equip the citizen army that must follow. So the citizen army would be beyond even the reserves. He added that Ukraine brutally illustrates that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. So what did he mean by a citizen army? He was not making a case for conscription or for an imminent call-up of volunteers. Instead, he was urging Britain to prepare for a mass mobilisation of tens of thousands of people should war break out. That would require planning and a change of mindset in government. Downing Street does not seem keen. It said the general hypothetical scenarios were not helpful. Yet the army is already looking at how it might create a citizens' army. One Whitehall source told the Times that the training of Ukrainian civilians on UK soil could act as a rehearsal for rapid army expansion. To train and equip the larger army would inevitably require money. The government says it wants to spend 2.5% of national income on defence, but it's not said when. General Sanders' speech was intended to be a wake-up call for the nation, but without political support, the mindset of a country that does not feel like it is about to go to war is unlikely to change. One ex-senior minister suggested to me that there was a generational divide between those who had lived with the threat of the Cold War era and those who had not. The former minister, currently a serving Conservative MP, pointed out that the Prime Minister grew up without that existential threat. Remember Sunak's young, he's only 43. He was born in 1980 at the very end of the Cold War. He came of age in the 90s and the 2000s. He's only a few years older than me. So that's referring to the fact that ministers in the Wilson, Callaghan, Thatcher governments grew up in the Cold War era or, were serving in that Cold War era. So they knew what that involved. Um, okay, so there's a lot to take in there. I think people need to calm down a little bit. Some people are overreacting to this and sort of acting as if General Sanders is calling for an imminent conscription. I don't think it's that alarmist. I don't think he's saying that. But I don't see anything wrong with what he is proposing, which is preparation. That's all. He's not saying let's have a mass mobilization tomorrow. He's simply saying let's have preparation. And I think, Starmer's potential government needs to be taking this seriously because we are in uncertain waters here. Now, my general views on the idea of conscription, the idea of national service to give its old name, I must admit I've changed on this. Let me explain. I was once dead set against it because I thought, well, for two reasons. Firstly, the professional army wants professionals, and to have professional soldiers taking up time to train basically civilians in uniform, that takes up time, and it would breed resentment between professional soldiers, those who have wanted to join the armed forces, and sailors and airmen, air personnel, I should say. Um, but also, I was against it on moral grounds because I thought it was wrong to basically take a year out of someone's life, take a big chunk out of their life in their early 20s or late teens, and basically force them to serve in their armed forces. But national service needn't be in the armed forces. It could be, for example, in a hospital or in a non-combatant role. Now, there's a few things that have changed my mind on this. Firstly, I do think the invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call to Europe. Now, the courage of the Ukrainians, the Western support for Ukraine has meant that what Russia thought would be a short war has turned into a real struggle for them. They have not won this overnight, and Russia has not yet attacked any other country. But Moldova is very volatile. The Baltic states, Poland, are constantly looking at what could happen. Recently, a Russian missile went into Polish airspace. So no one should be complacent about this. Remember, in 1912, 1913, the Balkans crisis seemed like a far off conflict. And then within a year, we had World War One. So this really, throughout the 1930s, there was a growing militarization of Germany. Then we had World War Two. I'm not suggesting a world war is about to break out, but there are some sinister echoes of the 1930s, I feel, particularly the 1930s. Um, you have a tyrant who is pushing an irredentist war, who's looking for, he uses so-called Russian speakers as his excuses for that. He's fear mongering among his own populace. There are echoes of Putin and Hitler. I'll say it. I'm not saying Putin is Hitler because the nature of the Holocaust was quite unique, but I do think Putin's the biggest threat to Europe since Hitler. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that's very accurate. Um, there's also echoes with Kaiser Wilhelm. When you look at the sort of obsession and the paranoia about living space and about this notion of being surrounded, that's a narrative that Russia has always been using. Um, so, whilst every conflict is different, there are echoes here of the past, and I think it would be foolish to ignore them. Now, I mentioned that my views have changed. If we look actually in the UK, leaving aside the geopolitical situation in Europe, I read earlier there was a gang of teenagers in Nottingham city centre wielding machetes. Now, absurdly, they covered their faces in the footage. I think that's absurd. I think that needs to change. But that's the situation we have. We have teenage offenders running wild, really, and they've no fear of the law. Now, I think restricted national service, conscription, of some description, and it doesn't need to be the military, but something as a form of basically punishment, as a form of getting this into control. Because at the moment they don't care about community sentences. And I think, frankly, the softly approach that's been adopted over the last few decades has been an utter failure. But I understand the resentment here. People will say, well, you're talking about collective punishment for young people. Not at all. I would say, restrict it to young offenders. Not necessarily the army, but some form of national service to. I'm not saying it would be a guarantee of straightening them out, but clearly they are not scared of community service. So there needs to be something more rigid, tougher. And I think in the case of violence, they need to go to prison. But that's one area that's changed my thinking. Some sort of partial conscription, but I wouldn't have a collective. The problem is if you say all young people should join up, it might look like collective punishment and sort of punishing all young people for the behaviour of young offenders. But the other thing is this geopolitical situation. We cannot ignore. Russia has been badly bruised, but it's not beaten. And you know what they say about a cornered dog, it's dangerous. Putin's still dangerous. So I don't think the general is being alarmist. I think he's just saying we need to take this seriously. And I'm a little concerned the government's being complacent about it. Now, from my own position, honestly, I know it's easy to say in peacetime and it's easy to say these things. Honestly, I would feel that I would want to serve. It wouldn't be, whether there's conscription or not, I would want to serve. I've already tried to join the Navy Reserves. Now, I was rejected. I've mentioned this before. The reason they gave was that I had been diagnosed with depression in the past. That was a big blow, and I was frustrated that I'd done 5 months of basic training, and, that was the reason they gave. But if this happens, if this goes ahead, then I hope that I would be reconsidered because of the experience I've got. I don't have battlefield experience, but I've got some basic training. Um, and I'm not saying that flippantly. I would serve my country, and I believe this isn't a case of. I believe when it comes to standing up to Russia, that is a just campaign. I do believe there is such a thing as just war. Or all war is terrible. All war is terrible, and we should never trivialize it. I've been watching Downton Abbey, wonderful series, but the second series focused heavily on the First World War, and it showed the futility of that and the sacrifice. I don't think we'll ever go to those sort of casualties again. And by World War Two, there was half in the British Army. There was half of the World War One casualty rates because things had changed in terms of field medicine had improved, the way regiments were divided up had changed, so you didn't have entire streets wiped out in the same way. Although it was still a very, very heavy cost in World War Two. Much bigger civilian toll, of course, in World War Two with the Blitz. But personally, I would serve. I would like to think that I would do that. But in terms of forcing people, I don't know. Well, let me know your thoughts. I personally, a lot of people have reacted to this very strongly and think, oh, it's terrible. I'll never do that. Well, I feel like I would be a hypocrite. I've spoken on my patriotism. I've been very vocal about Russia. So if I was to then turn around and say, oh, I'm not going to serve, it would be a bit hypocritical. Now, we no longer have the Edwardian mindset of Cardis in the same way, which is probably a good thing, where young men were literally shamed into dying with white feathers and so on. But I do think, if you're talking about patriotism, but you're not willing to serve your country, then it's hot air. And is it really a morally uprighteous position when you have a very real threat from a foreign adversary? Let's just say Russia, things really did escalate. Would it really be morally defensible for healthy men and women to refuse service to their country? Would that not be selfish? So there are really serious moral questions in this. Um, I mean, the idea of an occupation is something this country's never really had to deal with, but our continental neighbours have. The idea of an occupation, I think it's very unlikely to happen, very unlikely. But remember, in the pre-war years, particularly before World War One, there was naivety. There was a sort of gradual sense of, oh, it's a Balkans crisis, it's far away. I just don't think we can be complacent. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. Personally, I would feel that I would want to serve, but I understand why this is controversial, and I understand why, although I think people are overreacting, the general is by no means calling for immediate conscription. That's not what he's saying, and the government is not proposing it. But if things escalated, we would have to, every one of us would have to ask ourselves, what am I prepared to do? I mean, some people may be pacifists, but they could still serve the country. There's still hospital roles, there's still other ways to serve your country. And as a more general thing, I do think we should look at some sort of limited national service for young offenders. Because at the moment, they are laughing at justice. That has to change. Let me know your thoughts.